The two challenges are education, so we've got to polish the lens, and if you've heard me speak before, you know that I eschew the idea that MMT is some regime that you might shift to. You know, I often see on social media people with all good intentions saying when we have MMT, everything's going to be fine. And then we have critics getting up and say that, you know, if we have MMT policies, it's going to be chaotic. Well, there are really no MMT policies. There's a stability framework, which is the job guarantee, which is much more than just a policy option. It's an embedded stability framework, but other than that, there's no policies. And we've developed the lens. This makes me see better as I get older. And MMT is it makes us all, I think, see what's out there today in a better way. It gives us a richer understanding of the options that the currency issuing government have, what the consequences of a government surrendering currency sovereignty will be, and that allows us then to interrogate through the democratic process our policy makers, in principle, the politicians, in a much more effective and straight to the issue way. And if everyone gets an MMT understanding, then the quality of the political discourse rises, because we won't be lied to anymore. And we'll ask pertinent questions and we'll demand answers, and we won't be sidetracked with spin. So part of this session and the sort of work that I'm doing is to polish the lens a bit better, so that you're really not left with false ideas. And the other part that we deal with in this session is the idea of cognition, and that is, how do we overcome dissonance? And all of us get locked into particular frames and frames are just structures that we use to try to make sense of our external world, what we call our reality. And so we employ frames, they're reinforced by metaphors and language to try to make sense of meaning, try to get meaning, make sense of the world. And when we think we've achieved that meaning, and then a character like myself comes along, or the other core MMT group, come along and say things that are totally at odds with our version of reality, and which are totally at odds with what we have led to believe is intuitive thinking, then there's dissonance. And the dissonance ranges from ideological resistance right down to just difficulty to comprehend. So this is our roadmap for tonight, and we're going to start off with a quiz. So true or false? Well, the answer is clearly false. And these are some ideas on how to think about conveying the falsehood to people who have got dissonance. So, you know, most people are able to have never really thought about it, but it's very easy to get people to understand that the government is the currency issuer and the household isn't. And we use the government's currency, and we can't get it until they spend it. And that's fairly easy to get started in the discussion. And then you can sort of take the argument into some of the language that's associated with that falsehood about taxpayer funds. And I was in Edinburgh the weekend giving a talk, and the Scottish Greens leader was there. And she was talking about taxpayer funds are going to be necessary to help the Green New Deal initiative. And it was an interesting interchange when I pointed out there's no such thing as taxpayer funds funding spending. Yeah, we're taxpayers, and there are funds that are raised in taxes, but then the causal link to spending isn't there. Because if you go back to first principles, then we can't pay our taxes until they spend. government spends. And then you can go on and introduce real constraints. That a current session government has no financial constraints, but has real constraints. And then you reframe the whole debate as to what the discussion as to what these real constraints are and what does it mean to have a real constraint. And once you've got to there, you're on the victory lap. Here's question 2, and this is the next step in the argument. Taxpayers fund government spending. We know that to be false. And so then you can have a discussion on what. So there's a huge dissonance in that proposition, that we're paying our taxes, we go to work, and each year in Australia we have to file our tax return. It's a complex process, and we fill it all out, and all the tax form that we fill out, it's all online now, or we get a tax accountant to do it, but all of the form, the questions are all reinforcing, and I presume it's the same here, I know it's the same here, I've lived in here, all of the questions are reinforcing the myth. And so it's a really deeply held view that I go to work, I get taxed, and that tax is essential to buy public services and roads and infrastructure. And so you've got to work out ways to, because the first question is, if you say a government's not financially constrained, then the next question is, well, why the hell do they punish us with taxes? So what you're saying then is we don't have to pay taxes, because that's sort of an immutable logic. It just flows nicely. If you can get them to agree, if you can get a person to understand that the government doesn't have any financial constraints, well then you've got to explain to them why taxes are absolutely essential in the monetary system. And so this is a really difficult thing to explain to people, the idea, and you have to marry it back to the idea of real constraints. Because what taxes do is create real resource space for the government to spend into. And what does that mean? Well, you can summarise that even more simply by saying taxes create unemployment. And what does that mean? People say, well, how can taxes create unemployment? Well, that's the role of taxes, other than to create a demand for their worthless currency. The role of taxes is to take purchasing power off the non-government sector, so that will then leave real resources that they might have deployed with their spending, leaves those resources idle. That's unemployment. And then the spending of the government brings those resources back into productive use. But if the government was to just try to buy those resources that are already in use, then you're competing at market prices for those resources, and that would be inflation. So the government has to create real resource space. In other words, create unemployment, create idle resources, and then bring them back into productive use. So if there's unemployment in the economy, it's quite clear to me as an MMT person that either taxes are too high relative to spending, or spending's too low. Now it's quite interesting because Warren, who's one of my original partners in this, he emphasises the taxes being too high because he's more business oriented, and I emphasise the spending being too low because I'm less business oriented. But it's the same understanding. And what the government's trying to do is get real, because we own all the real resources in the economy, and it wants to get their hands on them. Why? Because the government. Why? Because that's the way to run the socio-economic program. So it's got to deprive us of using them and transfer them into the public sector. So you have to think carefully how you're going to explain that in steps Okay, so this is about borrowing. So if the government's spending more than it's taxing, then it has to borrow money. And so then you get a whole lot of stories developing about, oh, well, government spending just means we're going to get more debt on our backs, our private sector backed, and that eventually the government might have so much debt it won't be able to pay, or it'll have to put future taxes up. And if you dig more deeply into economic theory, you'll know there are theories about Ricardian equivalence, that government deficits are, the theory is government deficits are ultimately futile because they just offset, so the net injection of spending by a deficit is completely offset by us withdrawing our spending. Why? Because we fear the rising debt, which has to be paid back with higher future taxes, so therefore we save up now and reduce our consumption spending. That's Ricardian equivalence. Now that's deep economic theory. But it's a really, even at the most emotional level, we worry about government debt because we think it's something that, you get these debt clocks, and you get these conservative think tanks publishing these papers that every man, woman and child in the nation is now has, X number of pounds on their back. So it's a really big thing. The answer's false, of course. And so here's where you really get to the crunch. You say, well, look, if it's a currency issuing government, it doesn't have to issue any debt. Yeah.
So do you mind if I ask?
No, I don't.
Sorry. The question didn't say the government has to. It says the government does. And at the moment, our government is funding the difference. I appreciate it doesn't have to. But at the moment, the current government is borrowing.
No, it's not funding any difference. It's issuing debt to match. It's matching its deficit with the...
So it's the terminology.
It's absolutely crucial. It's the language issue. And as you'll see, the next point will disabuse you. It's not just a language issue either, it's also an analytical issue. And if you think about it, and I'll demonstrate this in detail in the next little module that follows this little quiz. And so I won't explain here, but public debt that's outstanding is just past deficits that haven't yet been taxed away. So I'll finish this point. So the funds that the non-government sector have available to buy the debt have come from the government anyway as a result of past deficits. So that should thoroughly disabuse you of this notion that they're issuing debt, therefore they're funding and spending. Because the only way they can issue debt today is because they've run deficits that they haven't taxed yesterday and back in time. And we'll see that really clearly, so I'm not... we'll see that bond sales just shift numbers within the government sector from one bank account to another. Type in reserve accounts down, debt account up, and when the debt matures and you pay it back, you type the debt account down and the reserve account in the bank's up. And the other point about it, of course, is that the narrative, the conservative, the neoliberal narrative, gets it completely backwards. Most people don't actually understand that the debt is just one expression of the portfolio of their wealth. And that when the government's when everyone's saying, well, what about the burden of the interest payments? Well, how can income paid from the public sector to the non-government sector be a burden to us? Last time I worked out, when I went and got my pay, I was getting an advantage. I was learned to think that income that we receive is good for us. Well, why is wage income or labour income good and income on interest payments on your wealth bad? And what's the difference between getting an interest payment from the government on the debt that you hold as opposed to getting a term deposit in your bank. We've got a couple more good questions. The crowding out argument. And yeah, David.
The stock of debt is always increasing, isn't it? Basically.
No.
No.
Australian government in 1996 was elected a Conservative government, John Howard and Peter Costello as Treasurer, and they set about running surpluses, and they ran increasing surpluses, and as debt matured, they didn't reissue it. And by the turn of the century, the government bond market was very thin. And who do you think complained about that? Investment bankers. And there was an inquiry that I was an expert witness at in 2002, where the government took submissions on why they should keep issuing debt, even though they're running surpluses. And my submission with Warren was that they should stop issuing debt because it was just corporate welfare. But the outcome of the inquiry, you can see it all online, it's Commonwealth Treasury debt inquiry. The conclusion of the inquiry and the government accepted the recommendation that they keep issuing debt even though they're running increasing surpluses. And that was just to salt to this. But the point was that prior to that agreement, they agreed to maintain a certain level of debt, Australian government debt in the bond markets. But prior to that, the debt was falling. Debt sometimes falls.
But there's a sense in which like debt that was issued in the 18th century is still sloshing around as...
No, not that debt. That debt's matured in the 18th century and paid back.
But it's been turned over.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of been continually turned over. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not quite understanding what you meant by taxing away the previous deficits.
We'll come to it.
Okay.
So this argument, most people think that's true, and it's built on the presumption that there's a pile of savings that fund investments and borrow, and that if the numbers of bids on that pool increase, well then the price of those funds have to rise because demand then rises relative to supply. The supply is considered to be finite. And so if the government goes into the loanable funds market, which is a classical economics construction which still persists today, then it's going to drive up interest rates, the price of the debt, and the private borrowers will be squeezed out at the margin. And then a morality play is overlaid on that, and that is that private borrowers are disciplined by their share markets, so they always make right decisions, and they are much more efficient in their use of funds because if they're not, they go broke. And governments are not disciplined by the market system, so they just waste money, build statues of themselves. And so you get this, the overall story is that we're wasting, and it's wasteful, and government shouldn't do that. And in a sense, it's what we call a supply-determined model of banking. This idea that banks have a little desk and they open their doors and they sit waiting for people to come in with their bags of cash as deposits. And when they get some deposits, they go into their reserves, and then they can lend that out. And so, if there's more people competing for those deposits, then you get the bank forces their price up. Now that's not, and that's taught in every mainstream monetary economics course. It's the foundation of mainstream monetary theory. Now, it's not rocket science to go and ask someone in a bank how it actually operates. And it's, bank lending is demand determined, not supply determined. Supply determined means the deposits that they can raise. And every bank in the world will sit there and they will not wait for depositors to come in, but wait for creditworthy borrowers to come in. And they will, whenever a creditworthy borrower comes in, they type some numbers which are a loan, and immediately those loans create deposits. The deposits don't create the loans, it's the opposite way. And they've got an unlimited capacity basically to do that. And the more creditworthy borrowers who come in at any point in time, the more loans they create and the more deposits they create. So the idea that if the government's trying to borrow money from the private system, that somehow restricts the capacity of the financial markets to lend to anyone else, it's just a fraud. It's just a fraud. Now, moreover, this point here, that what happens when government runs a deficit, spends more than it taxes, is that goes into the non-government sector in all different ways, procurement and transfers of all sorts of ways, and then there's all sorts of transactions that are going on, and those transactions ultimately show up in the reserve balances of the banks, because each bank has to keep a reserve account with the central bank. Now those reserve accounts are very special accounts. They don't lend from those accounts. Those reserve accounts are to make sure that the daily payment system is stable, because there's all sorts of checks and transactions going on between banks, and the way they're resolved each afternoon is by contra entries in these reserve accounts at the central bank. Now, if there are excess reserves in the system, so banks formulate an idea of what is going to be the likely draw against them on a particular day from other banks, and that's their required reserve estimate. And they don't normally, the reserves don't earn them any return. Since the crisis, the central bank has been paying returns, but typically not. And it varies in different countries. But they typically have earned below commercial rates. So banks don't want excess reserves if they can help it. They want enough so that they don't have to call. And the other point is that if they are short of reserves on any day, they can always get them from the central bank anyway. But they get them at a penalty typically. So, and there's a sort of moral view if you have to go begging to the central bank through what's called the discount window. That suggests you're not managing your bank very well. So they prefer to have the reserves, and they'll lend those reserves to each other, not to the whole retail market. And so if there's a deficit, there's going to be excess reserves. And if the system has excess reserve overall, an individual bank can lend them to another bank, because you might have a system excess, but you might have some individual banks that won't have an excess, who have to get reserves. But even if all of those banks on what's called the interbank market lend to and swap them, at the end of the day there will still be an excess. And if the central bank doesn't do anything, then the competition among the banks in the interbank market to get rid of that excess drives interest rate down. Yeah.
So the amount of excess reserves, or the amount of the deficit, doesn't necessarily equal the amount of outstanding bond sales then. It can also include excess reserves in the central bank.
So the point is that if the central bank does nothing and there are deficit flows going into the reserve accounts, well then there's downward pressure, not upward pressure. Now what the central bank has historically done is drain those reserves by open market operations, by selling government bonds to the banks in return for markdown of the reserves, so they drain those excess away. In more recent times, the paradigm has shifted, and since the crisis largely, and what they now do is just offer an interest rate a support rate on the excess reserves, so that the excess reserves just stay there. And the banks don't try to get rid of those excess reserves because they're getting a commercial return on them. So that's why the balance sheets of the central banks, the asset side, have been rising and rising, because there's huge reserves in the system. And this is the last one. This is the intergenerational story, or the ageing of society story, or whatever you want to call it. In different countries it's called different things. And this is this idea that we've got ageing societies. So there's more people like me than like this person or Christian here, younger person, Patricia, whoever. And societies that are ageing are going to have massive drains on public spending, because of hip replacements, pension entitlements, and all the rest of it, and pensions themselves. I said that. And so the government won't be able to cope with that, or it'll run out of money. That's the story that's fed. Now this story then is just one of the sort of narratives, the mythical narratives, that are used to persuade us to accept fiscal surpluses. So the argument goes that if the government's going to cope with my future hip replacements, then what it's going to have to do is save up money now and store it up, and the only way they can do that is to run surpluses and build up the capacity to meet the future demands. That's the ageing, the dependency, rising dependency ratio, ageing society, intergenerational debate. Okay, so that's false, and there's a number of different arguments you can bring into play. One is that the idea that governments save in their own currency in the same way that you and I save in their currency is just a nonsense. So if we want to have higher future consumption, then because we're financially constrained, we have to forego current consumption, spend less, and put the foregone consumption, the financial expression of that, into financial assets, get a return on them, and that increases our future consumption possibilities. That's the meaning of saving. But if you try to apply that to government, that's just ridiculous if it issues its own currency, because it can buy whatever is for sale in its currency today, tomorrow and next year, irrespective of what it did yesterday and the day before and the year before. So running a fiscal surplus now doesn't provide it with any extra funds tomorrow. It issues the currency. Stupid. And so the whole idea that you're going to run a surplus and save up is just nonsensical. But it's even worse than that. Because if you think about what rising dependency ratios are problems. So that part of the story is true. A dependency ratio is just the number of people who are working relative to the number of people who aren't working, and therefore dependent upon the number of people who are working. If more and more people aren't working, and want to maintain their material standard of living, well then the ones that are working and producing stuff have to be more productive than the previous generation. That's the challenge of the rising of ageing society. Not that the government won't be able to provide first-class healthcare and first-class support and pensions in financial terms. It's whether there's going to be sufficient real resources available from a smaller productive workforce. That's the issue. Now, if you then think about that, and think about the productivity challenge, then running surpluses now actually undermines the solution to the problem. Because it's stupid to think of saving up money. That's a non sequitur, forget it. But what you then go on to talk about is that by running surpluses now, the austerity, they reduce growth rates, they reduce investment and innovation, and they reduce productivity. They push teenagers who are the future productivity workers They force them increasingly into dysfunctional states. You know, the so-called NEET generation, not in employment, educational training, that's on the rise. The lack of investment in skill development, so we're very happy when we've got all these young kids flicking burgers. The destruction of apprenticeship schemes around the world, all of these things the austerity has inflicted on the younger generation, reducing their work to school to work transition probabilities and outcomes. And so we're doing exactly the opposite to what we need. What we need is we need to run strong public education, training, investment in best practice technology, and that doesn't happen if you're running austerity. So they're sort of ideas.